are still signing on, but we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 52nd episode of our monthly virtual seminar series. We started these webinars as a place to be clumsy, ask clumsy questions, to practice bravery and humility, to have conversations. And we're really grateful for the community that you've built around them. If this is your first roundtable, all you need to know is that they are designed for contribution, not consumption only. And as a reflection of that intent, the panelists have been given about 25 minutes total to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for discussion that we will facilitate both. I will facilitate both out of the chat and out of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. I usually start by talking about why this topic at this time by these speakers, but I don't think this topic needs a lengthy introduction. To those of you personally and or professionally experiencing a portion of the storm, we recognize the cost and we express gratitude for your continuing commitment to the work and keeping your eye on the prize for all, which is a restored and healthy Chesapeake Bay and watershed. As ecologist, I'm aware, and many of you are too, that moments of chaos offer challenges, but also opportunities, opportunities for reflection and refinement of what matters and how best to get there, for growth and renewal. And often the destruction of some things provides nutrients for something new. So let's note that the restoration work is no stranger to changes in political context. It's continued its work through at least 8 presidential administrations, and our strength is always that we've worked in partnership. So we are all in each other's good company as we navigate this latest challenge. And our speakers, I think, are the epitome of good company since they are master navigators. Kristen Riley will be speaking first. She's the director at the Choose Clean Water Coalition. She's a formal Chesapeake Research Consortium Environmental Management Fellow. She's been working in social media marketing way back in 2009, which was also during the formulation of the TMDL and also gave rise to the coalition. She's a volunteer dog walker, which may give her special skills when weaving the over 300 organizations in the coalition into a powerful voice to advocate for the Chesapeake Bay region. And I think the coalition's a superlative model since it gains really a superpower through its inclusiveness and the networking of advocates. This is an interesting fact. She seems to come naturally to the work. Her grandfather was one of the first people to work for the newly established EPA in the early 70s and helped write the Clean Water Act. Stephen Klein, or Steve Klein, is the president of the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, which is a regional nonprofit working to preserve farms and fields of Maryland's Eastern Shore. He joined the Conservancy after 2 decades as a lobbyist in Washington working on fish and wildlife conservation. And so his knowledge of geography applies to 2 landscapes, the natural one and the political one. I think he has a unique perspective on the risk to various parts of the natural landscape, and he's paired that with a deep expertise in the development of legislative language and the legislative process. I can't think of 2 better navigators to help us cross the choppy seas at this point in time. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kristen.
I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the impacts on the federal funding freeze and, specifically as it relates to our nonprofit community and the work of our organizations around the Chesapeake. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we are seeing and hearing from the Hill. I know a lot of folks are very interested in what is happening on Capitol Hill, and we were just there a few weeks ago. So happy to report back and give some of our thoughts on all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Like I said, I'm the Choose Clean Water Coalition. And just to give a little bit of background for most folks who may or may not know who the coalition is, we are a coalition of over 300 nonprofit organizations across the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. We have members all the way up in New York. I see some of our New York members on this call today, all the way down to Virginia Beach. and then everywhere in between: Delaware, West Virginia, Maryland, DC, Pennsylvania. We span pretty much every congressional district in the watershed with some sort of coalition member, some sort of presence. And we've been coordinating the communications, advocacy, and DIJ work across the Chesapeake since 2009. So as Denise mentioned, in 2009, as most of you all know, it was a big year for the Chesapeake, 2009 and 2010, with the creation of the TMDL and the executive order from then President Obama. The coalition was created at the same time, and this was not a coincidence. So with all of these, this new renewed focus on the Chesapeake and the renewed commitment to its restoration, there was a feeling that we needed to ensure we were coordinating the communications and advocacy work of all nonprofits across the Chesapeake so that we could sing louder and stronger with one voice. So when we have that shared message and we are coordinated in our efforts, we are stronger. Some folks would say you're stronger together, and I think that's definitely how the coalition looks at it. And so we have a lot of focus, as like I said, on communications, support, and capacity building in that space for our coalition members, providing trainings and resources, talking points, toolkits to our members to talk about a variety of issues at the state and federal level. And that usually feeds into our advocacy work. We do both state and federal advocacy efforts, whether it's appropriations and budgeting at the state or federal level, but also when it comes to bills and other legislation that'll help advance our work. We also regularly participate in permitting, especially at the state level with MS4 permits, and at the federal level, commenting on new regulations, as we are going to see a lot of that coming up in the next several years. And then obviously our commitment to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have one of our signature programs, our Young Professionals of Color Mentorship Program, where we pair young professionals of color in our field and looking to enter our field with mentors that will help guide them and is helping to bridge the racial gap here in our work. This is not something that the coalition is shying away from. It is something that our core, and we truly believe, with 90% of the watershed being privately owned, we need to engage in every community that we can in a meaningful and equitable fashion. If we are going to advance this work, there's just no other way to do it. We're going to have to work with everybody and ensure that everyone has a seat at that table and feels like their voice is heard. So we're very committed to that and working with our coalition members across the watershed to continue to advance that work. One other way that we do this is through our state lead program. So we have an organization in every state, and including the District of Columbia, that leads our work in that state. They are our eyes and ears on the ground when it comes to state policy, and they also help coordinate the efforts of our state members into to the federal level. So we convene our coalition members at the state level. We convene our coalition members around different policy priorities: stormwater, agriculture, the TMDL, equity in federal affairs, and energy. And continuing to just advance our work as one collective whole, and as like I said, is singing from the same song sheet with one voice. So why most of you all are here today to learn more about some of these federal funding freeze impacts. And so I'm just going to give you guys a high-level overview of what we've been hearing from our coalition members generally since January. This was a survey that was done soon after the first wave of freezes occurred. We've just issued a new survey out to our coalition members asking for updates on this, as we are now entering the phase of freezes turning into terminations of grants. And so trying to get a sense of sort of where folks are at now, numbers wise, but this will give you sort of a perspective of just over the last 2 months, what we've seen since the original funding freezes occurred. So when we put out this survey, we received 48 responses as of today. You can see with the size of the organizations that we're looking at, this include both paid and volunteer staff, since a lot of our coalition members are all volunteer organizations. So you can see there's a wide range here. We have a lot of folks that have, less than 15 staff, whether it's paid or volunteer. It gives you a sense of sort of the groups that were responding to this survey. Something that is interesting to note, that was actually really eye-opening for me personally, was the percent of organizations funding that is federal. If you're looking at this pie chart over here, I mean, you can see, looking at between 26% and 50% of our 20% of our coalition members are between 26 and 50%. If you're combining some of these together, we have coalition members that have either a quarter to 75% of their funding that is federally funded. So a lot of our coalition members really started to rely on this federal funding over the last 4 years. There were definitely coalition members who, and nonprofit organizations that are not in the coalition, that had never really applied for federal funding before or worked with federal funding until all of the new funding came out with the IRA, IIJA, BIL, whatever abbreviation you want to use, came out. And so a lot of folks received federal funding for the first time, but definitely, and then organizations that had federal funding in hand definitely increased the amount of federal funding that they had through these grant programs. So again, this information is coming from the early days up until today, of whether or not folks had received any kind of notification that they had a grant that was on pause due to the funding freeze. Over half of the respondents had, so it's unsurprising, especially since that was the main purpose of the survey. But how many grants were ever paused total between, January 20th, which was when the first executive orders were issued relating to DEI that have had an impact on some of these funds. And this is even if they have been reopened. So you can see the 7+ over here. So we had over a quarter of respondents said that they had how many grants were ever paused. Over a quarter of them said they had 7 or more grants that were actually on pause at one point or another. So obviously this is, extremely concerning, had a lot of widespread impact, is still continuing to have a lot of widespread impact here in the Chesapeake. This is funding that folks had planned for, that they have contracts with on the ground restoration groups, with material providers, with farmers, that they are unable to process and are unable to be paid. So it's extremely concerning, especially given the number of grants that some of these organizations are seeing on pause. We asked a little bit about the nature of the work that is being paused, and I really found this to be pretty interesting. People could select more than one because, as we know, a lot of our work here in the Chesapeake has co-benefits and is addressing more than one issue at the same time. If you'll see, the highest response here was certainly restoration, tree plantings, habitat creation. So over 60% of the respondents indicated that was one of the main purposes of the grant. You can see a lot of them were also related to either ag or stormwater BMPs. A lot, obviously engaging the community. We use the community to do most of these projects and engaging with them to implement them. A lot of environmental education as well, which I thought was interesting. So just sort of to ground sort of what is being put on pause here when it comes to these grants, right? We're talking about really important on the ground restoration work that is not moving forward because of these funding freezes. So this is a clip from our tracking sheet that we've created. I think someone is able to probably drop a link into the chat, or I can do it a little bit later. That'll send you guys to this link, but basically to help track sort of this for both us internally, but more broadly, and to help with our advocacy, we have started to track which high-level grant programs, like the status of those that are here in the Chesapeake. So obviously across the entire country, there are a lot more impacts that are being felt, other grant programs that are having impacts. This tracking sheet is specifically for the Chesapeake and the impacts here. So these are the terminated grants. This has been updated as of this morning. As you can see, there is a pretty distinct trend with what we're seeing as far as grants being terminated. Mainly EPA. This has happened really and had a big uptick in the last couple of weeks as well. EPA was a little slow on the terminations and had reopened a lot of its programs initially from the freeze, but we are now seeing many of these start to be terminated. You can also see a trend here that most of them, all of them have environmental justice in the title here. One group or one program that was terminated that was through USDA through the Urban and Community Forestry program. This is one that was terminated. Arbor Day Foundation was managing that program, and that grant was terminated and had an impact here in the Chesapeake. Yeah, for folks asking for the link, I think somebody else is able to. I can't do it right now because I'm sharing my screen, but I think someone else can. Thank you, Denise. And so then we have moving on to our paused grants. So you'll also see a trend with the paused grants that we have right now, shifting from EPA. Almost all of these are USDA funded. USDA seems to be the main agency, federal agency that is being very slow to release their funding. You'll see a few programs in here that come straight from USDA out, but you have some that are being put through the Virginia Department of Forestry, for instance. If you scroll down to the second part of this, there's a lot of grants still on pause. There's two slides here. You have some pass-through partners that you all are probably very familiar with, who have also had grants impacted because of this. Usually, so you'll see like the small watershed grants, the INSR grants, Chesapeake Wild programs, a lot of us on this call are very familiar with, that normally are funded mostly by other agencies, not USDA. There are certain grants through this program, so individual grantees may have received information that their grant is on pause because it was plussed up with USDA money. So when USDA received this new pot of IRA money, NIFWIF applied, CBT applied, all these other groups applied, so that they would be able to plus up some of these existing grant programs. They received that money, passed it through, and now some of these programs are on pause. The grant programs are still moving forward. Some folks may have just seen small watershed grant proposals are now being accepted for the next round. Same with Chesapeake Wild is about to open. So things are moving forward. It makes things a little more complicated because people are unclear what's paused and what's not. But this is also to show that there is an impact here specifically on some of the work that we're specifically advocating for, and that are affecting some of the folks on this call. I know specifically have grants that are on pause because they have a wild grant that just so happens to have USDA money attached to it. And we do have some unfrozen grants, again, few and far between. Some of those EPA terminated grants ended up here at one point and now are terminated. So it just really it depends. There really isn't, other than what kind of agency is pausing and terminating, there doesn't seem to be a lot of rhyme or reason on why things are going the way they are. But we're continuing to track this with the help of our coalition members as they report issues with drawing down or being paid for their work. This quote really stuck with me early on when we did our survey. And I don't think this person was alone. This was an anonymous survey, so I don't know who said this, which also gave me anxiety because I wish I could reach out to them. But it's very real. The impacts that are happening in the watershed are extremely real. These are organizations, these are people, right? These are their livelihoods. And I think that sometimes gets lost in our work as well. So I think this just goes to drive the point home that there are very real economic impacts that are happening, not just restoration impacts due to these freezes. So what are we doing about it? What is the answer here? What is the coalition working on, and what can other folks be doing in this moment? So these are the congressional districts in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We have 16 new members of Congress in the Chesapeake watershed. Since 2009, the coalition has worked diligently to build up, create relationships, and work with what we call Chesapeake champions on the Hill. We have enjoyed widespread bipartisan support for this work, for the funding, since our inception and even quite frankly before. We have been able to either maintain or increase our funding since 2009, even during the last Trump administration when the budget was originally zeroed out. And then later on when it was, I think, cut by like down to 10% of what the original funding was. So, and that is mainly because this is such a big program for both Republicans and Democrats. We've been able to work across the aisle, getting people out into their watershed, into their district to see the great work that is happening. It is very easy for us to be able to say, this is where the money is going, and this is the great work that it is doing on the ground. And so that's a huge part of this. And so with 16 new members of Congress, we have our work cut out for us. We lost a lot of really long-time Chesapeake champions here in the watershed. Obviously, like in Maryland, there was a huge turnover. So we were really working hard to sort of cultivate these new folks. So really the first time that we had the ability, the chance to do that in a very organized way was our Bay Day on Capitol Hill. This was the 14th year that we've done this. And this is the day that all of, coalition members from across, again, the entire watershed come down to DC to meet with their members of Congress to talk about the importance of the federal funding for the Bay program and for these grants specifically. Obviously, this year, there was certainly a different sort of message. While we were there, we were advocating for the next round of funding for fiscal year 26, while they were debating whether or not the government was going to shut down because they couldn't pass a budget for fiscal year 25. And we're also complaining about the fact that the grants are frozen from FY 24, 23, and earlier. So it was a very interesting time to be on the Hill. I would say the main message really ended up being about the frozen funding and the impacts, reminding members of Congress that they have already appropriated this money. This is money that they already passed, and is now not being doled out and is not being used for the purposes that they intended at this point. As you can see, this is demonstrating, again, widespread bipartisan support across the watershed. Congressman Smucker up there in the top left in Pennsylvania, new Congressman Riley in New York, had a really great conversation with him, and he is now joining the Chesapeake Task Force, the House Chesapeake Task Force. Our new senator here in Maryland, Senator Also Brooks, came to deliver her support for this work. And then Congressman Whitman. Congressman Whitman in Virginia has been an incredible Chesapeake champion for us. He has co-sponsored repeatedly Chesapeake Wild. He ensured that the ACE Act last year, which if folks don't know, it contains several reauthorizations for programs like EPA, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and others that are just so critical to our work. We call it one of the most important bills for the Chesapeake. He ensured that passed in the last Congress. He also books the room for us for this lunch, actually. And when he came to talk to us on Hill Day, delivered a message I think that a lot of people were hoping for and wanted to hear. He talked about the importance of the Bay, but he also talked about the responsibility of the federal government and the mandate that they have based on the Clean Water Act to participate in this effort and to be part of this. I think people left feeling much more positive about our work and what the future holds for us. But it's something that we need to continue to ensure we continue to communicate about, and again, getting people out to see and hear about the good work, and also the good work that is not happening right now because of the federal funding freeze. So I think I think that's the last of my slides, because I'm hoping to answer more questions during the Q&A, but wanting to sort of end on a note of there is hope and there is action that we can take moving forward.
Thanks, Kristen. And I let you go on because it was information that only you have, and I think was really, really important. So I really, really appreciate it. And with that, Steve, you're up.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Steve Klein. I'm the president of Eastern Shore Land Conservancy. And You just saw a very tidy PowerPoint. I'm just going to be forewarned is forearmed. This is a PowerPoint put together by a CEO. So get ready for a real adventure in graphic design and formatting. I just want to start out by saying I know that the news is exhausting, right? It's something new every day, and it can be really easy to feel like you want to disengage. And it's a lot. There's just a lot of things that are going on out there. But I don't think we can say that sort of the title of this webinar today was talking about reprioritization. And I'm not confident that we can say that there's been a reprioritization. There is still strongly bipartisan support for conservation, as Kristen mentioned. So perhaps we should refer to it maybe as the mother of all speed bumps. This is just it's going to be a momentary pause, maybe a little longer than momentary pause. Or if we take that news analogy that I just made, maybe it looks a little more something like that. It's going to be a bumpy road ahead. This might be where we're headed with not only federal funding, but all sorts of issues that people care about, whether it's the rule of law or due process and so many other things. So we'll see how things go. But the one thing I will say is that, this moment will pass. I wanted to talk a little bit before I get started about what ESLC uses federal funding for and the kind of things we do on the ground with these public monies. To talk about what a percentage of the federal budget we spend on natural resources and agriculture. It's about 1%, and you'll see. I think people generally know that we spend a lot of money on those things in blue. We spend increasingly more money on interest on the debt. And as those numbers go up, the amount we spend on things like natural resources conservation, it simply just doesn't keep up with the inflationary cost of those other very important priorities. I will also say that this 1% number is down from a sort of a long-term 2% average that we were trying to protect way back in the day as part of Paul Ryan's HR 1. So these cuts to conservation programs, as anybody who's been around this work for any time knows, they come up from time to time. This is almost part of the kind of the vernacular of this work. Every so often, we see these things be cut. The next thing I'll mention is, as you can see here, and this is from Chesapeake Progress, this is how much the federal government and state governments spend on Chesapeake Bay restoration year to year. And this is a little slightly dated. This is FY 2025 budgeted. And I want to be clear, people, I don't assume people know this. We are currently about midway through FY 2025, a year that will end in September. And the bill, there was a lot of talk about shutdowns last week. The CR, which is a continuing resolution, basically funds everything as it was funded last year. A really terrible way for the government to be funded. But that bill that was passed last week that you might have saw Chuck Schumer talking about a great deal, his decision not to shut the government down, that is funding the rest of a year that's already half over. And I think it's important for people to understand that. But you'll see here, and maybe your bar is in the way of the key to this, but the dark blue is what the states spend, and the light blue is what the federal government spends. And we spend about $2 billion in public monies on Chesapeake Bay restoration these days. And this gives you some flavor as to what those agency and department breakdowns look like. You'll see most of the funding here certainly comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but certainly there's EPA here, there's Commerce, there's Department of Defense. That gives you some flavor. And again, all of these are available at Chesapeake Progress, the funding page. So if you want to check them out, and this does not include IIJA. That's the infrastructure bill. If you want to check those out, sorry, it's the inflation bill. If you want to check those out, you can go to Chesapeake Funding Progress, and you'll be able to see much more data here. And then one more of these bar graphs. I don't do well with graphs, but I did wanted to talk a little bit here. And again, the Zoom bar might be covering the key here. But this talks a little bit about individual states and what they are doing in terms of funding as well. So all these numbers link up with the number in the original graph. So we spend a lot of money on conservation. We spend a lot of federal money. on conservation. There's certainly big numbers involved here, but as we saw in terms of the full federal budget, these, as we used to say on Capitol Hill, these are rounding errors in the federal budget. This is not making or breaking our deficit, our debt, or any of those things. You're not going to find enough money here, even if we zeroed out all of these programs, to make a dent in any of the things we hear talking heads talking about on the news. The federal government spends money on conservation with ESLC in two ways. The first of which is land preservation. And that is done through a number of different funding pots. And I'm just going to cover really a few here. Kristen mentioned Chesapeake Wild. That is certainly one way that ESLC is protecting land forever. And I want to be clear, when ESLC protects an acre, it is protected forever with a perpetual easement. We do not hold any easements that are short-term or term limited in nature. They are all protected forever. And we have somebody on the ground on every single easement, every single year, making sure the rules in that easement are being abided by. We also use Chesapeake Wild as Fish and Wildlife Service money. That was frozen and remains frozen from us. So we've got a project lined up at Dorchester County, the same county where Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge is located, that has already been identified for protection forever. And this landowner has basically been told, whoa, we'll get to you hopefully when we get to you, which hopefully is not that long from now. NAWCA, North American Wetlands Conservation Act, operates kind of the same way. That also will fund restoration. But for our purposes, we are using NAWCA dollars for conservation easements, and as well as the Army and the Navy. People might not be generally aware that the Army and the Navy pay for conservation easements, something I'm going to get into a little bit later. We also use RCPP and Farm Bill to protect acres just like this one. And people tell me that people love cows and love animals, so I wanted to put another one in here. And these are purchased conservation easements. And I wanted to be really clear and to clarify what that means. So anybody can donate an easement to ESLC, anybody that's got more than about 50 acres. We'll take a donated conservation easement, but in many cases, people prefer a purchased easement, which means they are getting a check for the conservation value of their land. And those are big numbers generally, especially in an environment where real estate prices are going in only ever in one direction. We now have private real estate transactions that are closing at $30,000 to $35,000 per acre. It's very hard to protect those lands with purchase conservation easements. It's expensive. The way that this works for the landowner is they have an appraisal done and they get a funding, a check for the conservation value of their land. And they roll, generally speaking, they roll that check, that funding back into the operation. We've had dairy operators who have put a purchase easement in place who have been able to buy better robotic milking equipment. We have had landowners that have been able to buy additional land to also put into protection, but to grow their agricultural land base. So generally we see these funds are reinvested back into the operation. It also importantly helps people stay on the landscape. For sure, that's a huge part of this. And we protect big farms as well. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, that Army and program here. And if I could just, so when I talk about purchase conservation easements, this is the Army's conditional use buffer program, consistent use buffer program. And so the Army will fund conservation easements with a cooperative agreement with ESLC in these blue and green areas. And the gray areas that are between the bay and the priority area are actually already protected. So the Army doesn't want to capture those. And what we're doing, which I think is so important to convey to people, is that we are lining up funding streams to get to the finish line. So you might have a farm that's worth, let's just say the conservation value, the easement is worth $3 million. Well, you might not have any single program that can get that done. You might have to match Army money, as we're doing now, with RCPP money, Regional Conservation Partnership Program money. And so the Army money might be flowing fine because it's in a cooperative agreement allocated to the Army and allocated to ESLC already. But the RCPP funding, that Regional Conservation Partnership, that Farm Bill money, that's been frozen, or maybe because USDA doesn't have that second level of political leadership in place yet. Maybe they're just waiting to make decisions. So you've got different pots of money that you thought were going to wind up at the same place at the same time. Well, now one of those trains is not moving at the same speed as the other, and you might not be able to get the project done. And we see that with restoration projects as well, where maybe we're using really important state pots of money, Chesapeake Bay Trust, DNR Trust Fund, to get construction drawings for living shorelines, to get designs and permitting for wetland restorations. And then our hope is that we bring in other federal pots of money to get the construction done, to get the dirt moving. And that is, those things have to line up exactly perfectly so we can get to really important and good places of conservation, get to the finish line, as it were. And we've seen some questions about certainly all of these funding streams. And what else is federal funding paying for? Well, it's funding forest health. In the case of Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, we have a property on the Choptank River that you're looking at right now from a drone that has an equipped contract that allows us to manage for some invasive wisteria and also to build some habitat as well, some brush piles. It's not a lot of money, but certainly I think you're seeing the flavor of these smaller, I don't want to call them grants. This would be called a contract from the Farm Bill. Really help landowners to do what's right by the resource, and they're just critically important. And that's some of our restoration funding. Here is a constructed wetland on one of our easement properties that was funded using NAWCA dollars. So there's a twofold strategy here, right? There's a conservation easement in place, and now we view the conservation easement as simply the first thing we do, not the last thing. We come in and talk to the landowner about what more they can do for conservation. And again, that requires strong funding support. And it's got to be done in a reasonable timeline. We can't be waiting 5 and 6 and 7 years for this to come together for us. Landowners decide to do something, they want to make investments, this stuff has to work out for them as well. And I think it's critically important. And in Maryland, as you might have heard, and I know there's a lot of non-Marylanders out there, certainly, but for those who care about this stuff at scale, Maryland is facing a terrible budget climate. Legislators talking about this being the worst budget climate they've ever seen, the worst budget climate in a generation. And so we are seeing this kind of perfect storm. I hate to use that analogy, but certainly of federal disinvestment with state disinvestment, and really it's going to slow this work down, as we saw with that mother of all speed bumps and that bumpy road ahead that we talked about at the beginning. And I wanted to also mention, I don't like to use a lot of words on the page here and read slides to you, but every federal dollar, almost every federal dollar, is matched by some other dollar that's not federal. And I talked about a few of those here. They can be state dollars, they can be private dollars, but I know Ducks Unlimited keeps very good track of the NAWCA match. That's North American Wetlands Conservation Act. So for every dollar that the federal government appropriates to NAWCA, there's on average about $3.20 that's non-federal money. So when you cut a dollar, you're cutting $3, $4, $5. It has a much bigger impact on the landscape. And that's certainly true of Land and Water Conservation Fund. These are just the two I mentioned. It is true of programs up and down the federal government and the state government as well. These things, we hear a lot about efficiency. And I use this analogy. If I stop paying my mortgage this month, there's going to be a lot of efficiencies I gain in the near term, cash flow being one of them. The longer term impacts, this doesn't turn out to look as efficient as it looked maybe on first look. And I wanted to I'll wrap up here by saying, this work, we've got a lot of folks, and if you read the newspapers and listen to podcasts too closely, you can start to think that this work is not meaningful, not a priority, it's wasteful, it's inefficient. But I would say, certainly we have got people, and this is one of the things that we have been trying to convey to our lawmakers, and it would be for folks who are looking for something to do today, It is to talk about the trickle-down impacts of this work in our communities for people who drive pickup trucks, who operate heavy equipment, who know how to run power tools, and they do that every day for their jobs. These are not, these are members of our community, right? This is not wasteful spending. These are hardworking, blue-collar Americans that have given rise, thanks to this federal investment, at least in part, to an enormous restoration economy that employs people in meaningful jobs. These are not people that are sitting around going to meetings all the time, and they're not. It's just not the kind of jobs that I think people have in mind when they think about this work. So get your lawmakers. Kristen talked about the lawmakers that we've got in the watershed here. Get them out with the landowners, and then also get them out. Have the conservationists and the professionals take a back seat, and let the people in the hard hats, the people with that know how to operate heavy equipment and can speak the language of labor, defend how important this funding has become to their livelihood. And the fact that if we stop doing these very important restoration projects, and you're looking at a bunch of them here, you're looking at forests, you're looking at a trail, you're looking at a number of things here, get them out on the landscape. And I'm going to wrap up just by saying, I think it's pretty important that as leaders, we all sort of share these thoughts, don't pull back from this work. There are a lot of people right now who are saying this is wasteful, it's not important, it's not a priority. We all know that's not true. Every generation of conservationists, for anybody who has spent any time with the history of conservation, you know that every generation has got its challenges. This will pass. It might pass like kidney stone, but it will pass. We will get to a new day, and these resources that we all count on are going to need us there when we get there. So the other side, the opponents of this work, the people who think it's not important, they might want you to quit. I think that's what they want us to do. They want us to quit. Let's not give them the pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And I really appreciate both you and Kristen giving us a realistic view, but with appropriate points of optimism. I appreciate that. I think the first question I'll ask, and Steve, I'll let you go first because you could just kind of add on to the end of your presentation. There were a lot of questions actually submitted ahead of time about what can your colleagues do to best support you in this time, besides donations. But I think you talked about how to talk to policymakers. There's been a request in the chat to put some talking points together for those who are inclined to write or call. We can certainly do that. But anything else besides what you mentioned?
Yeah, I think look for opportunities to volunteer with organizations. I would say, write to your lawmaker, even if it seems frustrating. That would be something I would recognize everybody or recommend everybody do. Reach out to your conservation organizations nearby and see what kind of help they might need. And I would say, keep reading the news, remain engaged, right? I think there's a certain amount of you want to disengage. It can be exhausting. It can be tiresome. Take a break, certainly, when you need one, but come back to the fight.
I'll ask you just a follow-up, Steve, because I've been asked this a number of times. Since you've worked really in a lobbying effort, can you just a brief note about send a letter, send an email, or phone call?
All three, I would say. You could do all three. And they're all, I'm not sure that how influential that they are when you get right down to it, but I think they have to hear from their constituents. One of the challenges that we had on the Hill back when I was there is, we would go in as professional lobbyists and then say, well, I'm not hearing anything from my constituents. Don't let them be able to say that. So however you're reaching out to them.
Thanks. Kristen, anything to add? And thanks for putting your talking points in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they're applicable to everyone. I mean, they're designed for our coalition members, but I mean, I would just echo what Steve said. I think, take away how you show up in this work, right, in the Chesapeake, and whether you're a federal employee, it's being impacted, you're a nonprofit, it's having their funding frozen, your scientists, you are a citizen of the United States and you are represented by somebody in Congress, somebody at the state level who was elected for your best interest, to ensure that your best interests are being demonstrated at the federal level. And you have every right as a citizen, regardless again of like how you're showing up in this work, to tell them what you need and what you're seeing and what you are not happy about. It is imperative that we remind both parties that that's who they work for, right? And that you are just like voting, you are communicating with your representatives early and often, right? And it does work. I know I hear from folks like, well, does that really actually make a difference? It does, right? And we're seeing that on the news. We're seeing people showing up to town halls. We're seeing these things happen, right? And it really is, one thing for me and my coalition members to go to the Hill and talk about this work. They're all, representing the district of that office, right? But it's even more impactful, to Steve's point, when we're bringing in the farmers to that meeting, right? We're bringing in the small business that is not being paid because of this work, right? That's telling another level of the story. And we need people on this call. We need, the broader community to do that. And so it can be a little nerve-wracking the first time you call an office, but they hear it all the time. You won't be the weirdest call they've had that day nor that week. So pick up the phone, shoot an email. They tally the topics that they get every day, and the top 5 rise to the top, to move forward and let the office know what people are talking about. So, join us as advocates in that way. Advocate for the Chesapeake, but also advocate for yourself, right? That you are someone that should be raising their voice as well.
Thank you. Another question that's kind of related to that is you both lead very effective organizations. They do different things, but they're both very good at what they do. What changes are you making in terms of planning or priorities or emotional management plans in light of the uncertainty in DC that you can offer advice for other organizations?
So I think, speaking to that last part, I think what's important is and this is something that I, on a personal level, probably struggle with as well, but to don't take on everything, right? Chris and Riley, choose clean water. We are not going to save democracy, right? But what can we do? What do we have an impact in, right? And that does make a difference, right? That does serve a purpose to the larger good. But I think it's important to be realistic about what you can and cannot control, for a variety of reasons, but mainly because you will see a result with the things that you can influence and that you can control. And so just doing one small thing each day, right, that makes you feel like I did something different today. I think that helps manage our mental capacity, right? As Steve said, you want to stay informed, watch the news, but it can also be extremely depressing. It can be extremely anxiety inducing, right? Go outside and touch grass, get away for a little bit, right? And just remember why we showed up to this and get, rejuvenated in that sense. So don't take on too much, right? Don't start to catastrophize as much as you might want to, right? There are good things happening. There are good people that are still doing this, and people are still passionate about it. And just find that healthy outlet that makes the most sense.
Oh, thanks. Steve, how about you? How are you changing your leadership or adjusting?
Well, I think for us, it's the gritty detail of it is we're crafting a 2026 organizational budget that reflects uncertainty, and being sure that we're communicating that with our supporters, right? That we are fortunate in that we do not peg a lot of our staff expenses to grants necessarily, but the work will slow down, and being very clear about what that means. And I think that's the detailed thing we're doing. Well, we're leaving space for people to voice their frustration at the beginning of every meeting we have. I think it's important. People often look to the leaders of their organizations in ways, times like this, to say, it's going to be okay. And you can't always give that type of reassurance, right? But you're going to try very hard and just to let folks know that they're on your mind, and and you care about kind of where this is all headed. And yeah, it's challenging for everybody.
Let me, Steve, I'll ask you to go first on this one, and then Kristen. What's the potential for private philanthropy to fill the gap, the federal funding gap? And Steve, I thought you made a really important point about, with the matching for federal funds, that leveraging ability is something really difficult to replace. So can you just speak a little bit to whether private philanthropy can fill the gap, or how we should pursue that?
Sure. One of the things that I find challenging as we talk about this sort of cultural moment is that, the government doesn't function like a private industry. And so you can't put necessarily a CEO and treat the government like a business and say, all right, we're going to cut all these people, because there's not a profit margin that stakeholders would recognize, or excuse me, shareholders would recognize as such. And so the things that government is funding are things that, quite honestly, the private sector hasn't found a way to monetize clean water on a profit ledger, right? On a shareholder perspective. And so I don't think that we can fill the gap with private philanthropy. I mean, a single conservation easement at ESLC could be north of $5 million. Wetland restoration, living shorelines, very expensive, as some of the folks on the call here know. I just don't think private philanthropy can help make organizations whole. I think this work cannot be funded in any meaningful way simply by private philanthropy. We need the government to come back to the table.
Thanks. Kristen, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I've been in a lot of conversations with many funders here in the Chesapeake, and it's simply there just isn't enough funding right here to replace the role of the federal government in this. I have said this many times over the last several weeks. There's just no real replacement for the role that federal funding has here. As Steve said, it is critical for match. For a variety of things, like we advocate at the state level for increased state funding to match federal funding often. And now here we are saying, no, we need this federal money to come in to go with the state. And yeah, there really isn't that replacement. I know that the many private funders are thinking about, and even creatively of ways that they can support organizations during this time, but there's nothing else that's going to step up. We really need to push to make sure that the federal funding continues to flow.
Thanks, Kristen. And now I'll start with one for you, because you were just on the Hill a couple of weeks ago. Have you gotten any indication of what changes, or if anyone envisions change, or there's any signals for future of funding restoration work?
So, as I said in many of the conversations, pretty much, I don't know of any conversation that didn't have some sort of positive, reaction when it came to the funding. So in the 6-month spending bill that Steve was talking about that just passed, we do have our previous funding amount, $8 million for Chesapeake Wild, was included in that spending bill, which is great. We're asking for 15, but 8 is great. Take it. That's what we have now. And we are, and we did receive confirmation that we have steady EPA funding as well in that spending bill. So, and as I said, in a very bipartisan way, it was a long, overwhelming commitment to our work and to the funding. Several members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, did reference that the funding people attempted to eliminate it, right, in the last administration, and that was reversed because of members of Congress, right? And so I do think that they feel very passionate about this, and it's something that they're going to push for. So, I don't want to say with any certainty, right, because literally anything could happen in the times that we're living in. But I think the key here is to continue to demonstrate the impacts. Again, we have 16 new members in Congress. Some of those folks are already very familiar, already Bay champions, but we do have folks that, need to be coached. They need to have, to get out into their districts and to see the work. I think a lot of the folks on this call, but practitioners and other NGOs can do that. And we're happy to help coordinate some of that if people need help. But we just need to continue to tell the story. And one thing I will say too, just as like a sort of message of hope when it comes to this, is that, like I said, Congressman Whitman has been a longtime champion of the coalition and of our asks in the Chesapeake. He came at the end of our lunch. He was running from another meeting and he slipped right in at the end. And he brought with him one of the new members of Congress in Virginia, Congressman McGuire. He's a brand new Republican, replaced Congressman Good for folks that are in Virginia. And I don't know if Congressman McGuire knows much about our work, knows much about the Chesapeake, and knows much about this funding. But he came because Whitman vouched for us. He was there because Congressman Whitman said, I want to bring you in. I want to show you what this work's all about. And I want you to build you as a new champion, right? And so Congressman McGuire was the last person to speak at our Hill Day, admitted that he had a lot to learn and was looking forward to getting out in his, district. And I think that says a lot, right? That is huge to have someone like that on the Hill that's willing to vouch for us, and to help us educate, right? And so I think we need to help take him up on that and get folks out. But, just these little glimmers of hope that we did see, and that this work does make a difference and that we are making change.
Steve, from your ear to the ground, have you heard anything sort of similar, or do you get a similar feeling?
I get a similar feeling about Congress. Yeah, I think that there will be an attempt. I think I'm relatively confident by House Republicans to codify dramatic cuts in whatever they try to appropriate for FY 2026. That they can't get that through what's functionally a 52-48 Senate, because it's just not 60 votes, right, for huge draconian cuts. The question that I've got that I don't have a good answer for, I'm not sure anybody has a good answer for, is what are the implications of an executive branch that seeks not to spend those monies as appropriated by Congress? And for folks that want a brief history lesson, research Richard Nixon and impoundment. He tried to do exactly this thing in the early 70s, and Congress said created, in fact, the modern budget infrastructure. The Office of Management and Budget was a result of him trying to do that. So the question is, how does that play out? Much more difficult to predict what is functionally the unpredictable. I think Congress is going to be okay in the long term, and there are ways to advocate for this stuff. Back in the days of Paul Ryan's H.R. 1, which zeroed out a lot of conservation funding, we created the America's Voices for Conservation, Recreation, and Preservation, AVCRP, that frankly beat a lot of that back, and we did okay. So as I said, I think we're going to get back to an okay place, but it's going to be a little lumpy between now and then.
I long for precedented times, right? As we finish up, any just kind of ending notes? I'll let Steve go first, and then I'll ask Kristen. Any ending notes you'd like to offer?
I think people are probably getting tired of hanging in there, but hang in there. And as Kristen said, I like that. Get outside, right? We all protect these places, but we spend a lot of time in these offices and on these calls. Take your friends, take your family, take your dog, take your whoever you want, and get outside and enjoy these places, because that's what they're here for.
Thank you. Kristen.
Yeah. I just reiterate, take action, call your representatives, tell them, what you think, and how this is impacting you. And especially, again, as Steve said, your local economies. Get outside, get away. And you can do that through volunteering through one of our members. We have, again, 300 coalition members across the Chesapeake. Go to our website, you can find one. Steve is one. Go volunteer with Steve. I'm sure he got something you guys can do. I know someone had mentioned, donations. I would say right now for some organizations, donating is one of the best things that you could possibly do. I know not everyone has that ability financially, so donating time is great. But I mean, as I said, a lot of folks right now are going paycheck to paycheck with paying their staff. And so, any way that you guys can help in that sense is great. But, again, any of those things are going to help our coalition members and help us be able to sort of move forward in this really difficult moment. And reach out to your local organization and see what they need. Ask them what they need. Do they need some volunteer time in the office? What are they looking for? And I think it'll be mutually beneficial for you and for the organization to do that.
Oh, thanks. And I can't thank the two of you enough. And you are master navigators. So thank you. Thanks to our audience. Again, if you don't know, we forward any unanswered questions to our panelists and get back to you, hopefully, with some answers. So don't despair. And everyone, hang in there and join us next month for our next CRC Roundtable. Thanks again.